A new study says global temperatures are set to rise beyond the target limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius unless there are rapid and immediate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions.
It is unequivocal that human activities are responsible for climate change. That's the finding of a new study by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the most up-to-date assessment of how global warming will change the world in the coming decades.
The UN Climate Panel predicts the coming decades will bring more extreme weather events like the floods and wildfires we've seen in the past weeks.
Environmental experts have called it a massive wake-up call.
Authors say the report is a final reality check.
The report says global average temperature rise could reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius.
1.5 degrees Celsius?
In the next 20 years. Now that is 10 years sooner than expected.
Well, this report shows, to the best scientific evidence available, just how much one single species, humans, have changed the planet in the space of a few hundred years. And the changes that they find, as you said earlier, they're widespread, rapid, and intensifying. And that means everything from heat waves getting hotter to Arctic ice melting and things that will last well beyond our own lifetimes.
The IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has recently released yet another report stating that we are on a collision course to imminent climate catastrophe. Now, most of the people in my audience, I don't have to explain to you how climate change is a real thing and how human beings have contributed to it, but today we're going to talk a little bit about one of the side effects of that climate change, and more or less one of the side effects of capitalism itself that's driving this one part of climate change. And of course, that is the wars over water. You've probably heard a lot about this in the news, and they're probably telling you a lot of different things. And today, hopefully, I'm going to clear up a little bit about that, and try to find where all of these problems surrounding our freshwater reserves really comes from. Hi, my name is Aaron, this is my show Re-Education, and today we're going to talk about the wars over water. With all of that being said, let's jump into it. Now, the wars over water are essentially being used to scare the population. That isn't to say that the wars over water aren't going to happen, or in fact, in some places, are happening now, or aren't happening now, but it does mean that it's being used as a tool to manipulate people. And the way that I see it, it's really trying to focus all of the attention away from the actual causes and center it around you. Essentially making you feel like you are the problem and only you can solve this problem, when really this isn't an individual issue at all. It's systemic, almost entirely systemic. And there are three main narratives that I've noticed being pushed again and again and again in regards to this topic. The first one is the idea that individual consumption is the driving force behind the destruction of all of our natural water sources. The second one is to push for war, and the third one is even more sinister than that. It's more or less an eco-fascist look on society and a plea for population control. All of these, I would say, are completely wrong, and these narratives are essentially being used as scapegoats. I've watched 5 or 6 different stories specifically surrounding the wars over water, and all of them have had elements of either one, if not all, of these different factors. Individual consumption is constantly pushed as the main narrative, saying that if only we used low-flow toilets or we didn't run showers as long, then we could personally change all of these problems. The pro-war narrative is often being used to spark controversy about water in other countries, essentially manufacturing the consent of the American people to allow the American government to send in their military to secure the water resources of other countries. Now, this can be used in many different ways against many different countries. For instance, China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, has been building a lot of hydroelectric dams. Now, they might be building these dams so they can manipulate and control other countries economically, and that is definitely a problem. But the United States is also able to use that as propaganda for them to say that they are damaging to other countries, and they need to invade China to stop them from building all of these dams and choking off the water supply of countries downstream. A similar situation is also happening in Syria, where American-backed ISIS fighters have been taking control over different parts of water resources leading into the main part of Syria, essentially using those hydrogeographic locations as leverage so they can gain a foothold or tighter control over the entire area. And not to mention, also upstream from Syria, you have Turkey, who is essentially an American ally, and they've been using their resources to choke off Syria and their water supply for a long time. And yet again, we see another example of this in the Palestinian territory that's occupied by Israel. The Israelis are finding different ways that they can choke off the water supply to the Palestinians, essentially forcing them to either leave or die. And in most cases, they can't leave, so they die. So it is a very real fact that the wars over water, or at least wars regarding water, have been happening for a very long time. Withholding water supplies from different groups of people is an old tactic. The Romans used to do this, and it was called attrition warfare. They would burn down entire fields, starving people out of their homes. They would cut off water supplies and all different measures to be able to essentially win the war without ever firing an arrow or throwing a javelin. A pilum, I guess it would be. It's a pilum. And this happens all of the time. Like I was saying, Turkey taking their water away from Syria, Israel taking their water away from Palestine, the American government taking the water away from the native peoples, and American corporations taking water away from the American people themselves, like we've seen in Flint, Michigan. And since my home of Canada has some of the largest freshwater reserves in the continent, eventually the American government is probably going to try to take our water as well. Water has often been used as a weapon for regime change within society, and those who live upstream from those who live downstream essentially have an advantage because they can do whatever they want with the water, and the people downstream don't have much of a choice. So it's obvious that water has been used as a tactic to start wars and win wars all throughout history. But there's also this new angle that I've noticed that a lot of different outlets have been pushing, and that's of course eco-fascism and overpopulation. Now, if you have the mindset already that human beings, specifically individual consumers, are the ones that are causing all of these water problems, then obviously if you see the population increasing, then you're going to think, oh no, more people means more problems, because more people means more individuals creating individual consumption, and that's going to destroy the world. But I'm not really sold on that idea. I personally think that's very flawed, and the numbers happen to back up my argument on this. Just 100 companies are responsible for 70% of all carbon emissions. And when it comes to destroying the water reserves, it's most of those same 100 companies that are creating the problems. Of course, greenhouse gas emissions and climate change itself helps to dry up a lot of our natural water reserves. But it's not just climate change that's drying up all the rivers. It's these corporations actively destroying and taking all of the water for themselves. So if this isn't about individual consumption, I guess the real question we have to ask is, where is most of this water going? Well, it turns out that the vast majority of the water, 70%, is going specifically to agriculture. More specifically, to corn. Agriculture is a major user of ground and surface water in the United States, accounting for approximately 80% of the nation's consumptive water use and over 90% in many western states. Corn is the primary U.S. feed grain, accounting for more than 95% of total feed grain production and use. In the United States, corn uses more land than any other crop, spanning some 97 million acres, an area roughly the size of California. U.S. corn also consumes a large amount of fresh water resources, including an estimated 5.6 cubic miles per year of irrigation water withdrawn from America's rivers and aquifers. And fertilizer use for corn is massive. Over 5.6 million tons of nitrogen is applied to corn each year through chemical fertilizers, along with nearly 1 million tons of nitrogen from manure. Much of this fertilizer, along with large amounts of soil, washes into the nation's lakes, rivers, and coastal oceans, polluting waters and damaging ecosystems along the way. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is the largest and most iconic example of this. And when I said at the beginning that 100 corporations are responsible for this, it's not just 100 that are responsible for this. It's one. Monsanto. Monsanto currently owns 85% of corn in the United States. The company's seed library dominates the market so much that American farmers, even organic farmers, have little choice but to buy from them. They essentially have a seed monopoly, and everybody who wants to be a farmer and whoever wants to produce corn has to buy their seeds from Monsanto. And most of the seeds, if not all of them, are sprayed with different chemicals to make it so that only those seeds can be planted in that ground, because the chemicals used pretty much destroy the ground and make it impossible for new seeds or untreated seeds to take root and actually grow. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, Aaron, wait a second. We need all of that food because our population is humongous and we need to feed these people. If we didn't produce this much corn, we wouldn't be able to produce as much food, and therefore people would die. And to that, I would say, actually, about 40% of all of the corn that's produced goes directly to making ethanol, fuel. So instead of going into people's bellies, it's going into different forms of machinery or vehicles and essentially creating more pollution. But obviously corn must be the most efficient crop for creating ethanol, which is a renewable fuel source. And shouldn't we want more renewable fuel sources? And to that I would say, again, no. Corn just happens to have the most infrastructure in the United States. An acre of corn only produces around 460 gallons of ethanol, while an acre of sugarcane produces 560. And I'm sure that we could find other methods of producing renewable fuels that are far more efficient than harvesting acres and acres and acres of unmanageable cornfields. Not to mention, open-air farming is inherently more resource expensive and water expensive than having indoor gardens, or finely tuned biodiverse ecosystems, or even vertical farming. But we do the corn thing because the corn people have a corn monopoly. Like I said, Monsanto owns the corn. They own the corn, they own the fields, they own everything. So if they want to do it with corn, they're going to do it with corn. That's their prerogative. That's part of the reason why capitalism is so destructive. Even if we can find better alternative methods of doing things, we continue to do the same bad things because the people that did the bad thing in the first place already have a monopoly on the industry and can stop any other corporation or idea person from using those ideas. So ethanol is 40% of all of the corn. So what's all the rest of the corn used for? Certainly for feeding people. No, it's not. It's used for feeding animals. At least another 36% of it is. And that, of course, is being done through factory farming methods, which we already know are incredibly destructive and, not to mention, absolutely inhumane. Other countries that are feeding their animals on grass or different types of grains have healthier animals, healthier meat, and healthier people. And also, the animals aren't suffering inside of tiny cages eating nothing but processed cornmeal crap. And that doesn't even talk about how we should be slowly moving away from the meat industry in the first place, because most of that is completely unsustainable. I know all of you meat lovers out there are going to hate me, and hey, I love meat too, but I can't think of any moral reason why the vegans are wrong. You know what? Fight about it in the comments section down below. So, like I was saying, agriculture takes 70% of the world's fresh water reserves. Coming in second place, a far second place, is textiles at 4%. The textile and garment industry is incredibly expansive and accounts for about 4% of the use of all natural water reserves. But it also creates 20% of global water waste. 79 billion cubic meters of fresh water is used yearly by the fashion industry. This is mainly because cotton has a very high water demand, and the main material in most of our clothes is cotton. It takes 7,000 liters of water to produce one pair of jeans, which is the equivalent of about 5 to 6 years worth of water for one human being to drink. A t-shirt requires 2,700 liters of water, enough for one person to keep thirst away for almost 3 years. The most significant water use occurs during the production of raw materials, mostly in the cultivation of cotton. Quantities continue to increase to the tune of 80 billion new garments globally every single year. That works out to about 10 new garments for every single person on the face of the earth, but of course, that's not how the distribution actually works. The majority of those clothes actually go to America, of course. The average American consumes 58 garments per year, which I'm sure Canada is very close to that. That's over 19 billion garments per year in America alone, or almost 24% of global clothing consumption. Not to mention the ones that are destroyed by the retailers themselves who are trying to keep the prices at a certain level. Now, much of this is due to fast fashion. But most people will tell you that fast fashion is an individual consumer's problem. It's the fault of all of us for wanting to buy new clothes all the time. But that's not really the case. Clothing is being made at a lesser and lesser quality, requiring people to buy more and more clothing because the clothing doesn't last as long. If things don't last as long, you have to buy them more frequently because they fall apart or break. Just like one of these babies. And, on a side note, just like light bulbs, they actually instituted a 10,000 hour maximum cap on light bulbs for about 100 years, just so that the light bulb manufacturers wouldn't go out of business. The same thing happens here with t-shirts. T-shirts are in high demand because a t-shirt for $5 will probably only last a few months before it falls apart and you have to get another one. But it's only $5, so what's the problem? The manufacturer produces lesser quality goods, so you have to buy more of them, essentially forcing you to always spend more money. This isn't an individual consumer problem. This, again, is a systemic problem that is being focused on the individual consumer. Trust me, most people that are poor, I know this because I'm poor, I'm going to speak for all of the poors here for a second, but if we could get clothing and equipment and everything else at a higher quality for a lower price, we would do that, because that's what most rational people would do. And a lot of this is also happening because capitalist corporations incentivize consumption as a form of recreation. I'm sure if you were to break this number down even smaller, the majority of people that are in the have-not class in America probably can't afford new clothes all of the time and make do with ripped t-shirts, while the haves are still able to afford many different outfits many times a year and just throw them away willy-nilly. But if we're talking about poorly made, cheaply built, and very inexpensive clothing, the first place you would probably look is Walmart. Walmart produces an unfathomable amount of clothes every single year, and a lot of those clothes just end up in landfills. The majority of the clothes in Walmart, and essentially every store, come from cotton that was cultivated in India, manufactured and spun into actual clothing in India and in China, and then sold to the people of China and America primarily, necessitating more and more water being used. It's depleting the aquifers and underground water in India entirely, and like I was saying, producing more and more wastewater every single year. But the highest polluters of the water aren't necessarily the clothing manufacturers or even the agricultural industry, though they do produce an immense amount of pollution. The largest polluter is Northrop Grumman, a, quote, American multinational aerospace and defense technology company with over 90,000 employees and an annual revenue in excess of $30 billion. It is one of the world's largest weapon manufacturers and military technology providers. They produce the most water pollution by far, showing again that war, and profiting from war, is driving the war over water. The next 5 corporations that pollute the water the most are all chemical companies, which if you watched my last video about an anarchist utopia, you probably already assumed that they had some portion to play. The top 5 water-polluting chemical corporations are BASF, LyondellBasell, Dow Inc., Celanese, and Eastman Chemical. It's like it always just comes back to the chemical corporations. Again, we have mostly chemical corporations causing most of these problems. All of the ones that I just listed, and then of course Monsanto. We also have a lot of other industries that take a lot of water resources as well, like meat production, the beverage industry, and car manufacturing corporations. So to summarize, the wars over water are a real thing, and they're going to continue to get a lot worse. But it's not happening for many of the reasons that they're telling you it's happening for, and the solutions are certainly not the solutions that they have proposed. They, as in the mainstream media talking about this shit. Most of them are already in the pockets of a lot of the corporations that are doing the damage, and the ones that aren't, well, manufacturing consent is still a thing. And if you want to know more about that, check out my videos on manufacturing consent. And for more information about how the chemical industry is destroying the planet, check out my last video about the anarchist utopia. We can't blame individual consumers for systemic problems. We have to fix the systems that created these problems to actually solve the problems themselves. Without real systemic change, we're not going to be able to save things in time. So we have to get out there and we have to actually change things. And to actually change things, we're going to need a real revolution. I'll leave a list of a few book recommendations down in the description box below, and as always, keep evolving.